everyone, and welcome to another edition of AASCENTV, Life on the Autism Spectrum. Our guest for this episode is Professor Bradley Irish. He teaches English at Arizona State University and has done research and even published a book on the topic of neurodiversity and literature.
And I'm your co-host, Keith Halperin. And our final co-host is Will Vernick. Will, you have an interesting T-shirt. Could you show it to us, our audience?
Glad to. Um, this episode shirt is this episode. I have my Best Buddies Friendship Walk shirt. As many of you know, every year Best Buddies has their friendship walk in Golden Gate Park. We had it again. We had it last April. We had a big turnout this again.
Thank you very much, Will. Could you begin with our guest?
Glad to. Bradley, tell us about how you came to the autism community.
Absolutely. So I learned that I was autistic only about 3 years ago on the day before my 40th birthday, actually. I had sort of always known that I had some uniquenesses. But growing up, no one ever floated the possibility that I may be autistic. It never came up in any of screenings I did in school or any talk with therapists or anything like that. But for whatever reason, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I just got this inkling that maybe I was autistic. And so eventually I brought that up to a therapist I was seeing at the time. And she said, well, I don't really have any sense that that would be the case. Why do you think that? And I began to sort of list some of the sort of ways I am that she didn't necessarily notice or she didn't necessarily know about. And once I started talking about that, she said, huh, I think you better get tested. So long story short, I did. And I determined and discovered that I'm both autistic and have ADHD. And that was a kind of enormously fulfilling life revelation. And now I feel like I'm the happiest I've ever been, and I understand myself better than I've ever understood myself before. So I've always been autistic, obviously. I just recently have discovered it, and now I feel like I know who I really am.
So, Brad, can you tell us, was your diagnosis of autism, is that what directly led you into your study of autism within literature, or were they sort of coincidental? Tell us about
Yeah,
that,
no,
if you.
absolutely. So I should say I'm a professor of English literature. My primary focus is on what we call Renaissance or early modern literature. So literature from the 16th and 17th century, roughly the time of Shakespeare. And I was always interested in the way that human minds work. And in fact, my academic specialty for the first 15 years of my career was on the topic of emotions. So I talked about literature and emotion and how emotions worked in literature, and that's always been sort of my bread and butter. But then once I got the autism diagnosis and I learned that I am neurodivergent, I naturally started to think about so obviously there have always been neurodivergent people even before we sort of had the terminology and the ideas to talk about them. So I started thinking about neurodiversity and neurodivergence back in the time period that I studied 400 or 500 years ago. And that kind of opened up a whole new area of research. I still study emotion, but now I understand my work as being in this larger field that's developing of literary neurodiversity studies. And I think that these things, rather than being separate, are actually quite combined because, of course, emotional functioning is a kind of part of neurological functioning. And so
Mhm.
I think that I've always been interested in emotion, and now I see neurodiversity as this broader umbrella of
Mhm.
studies that I'm doing now, and that led to this sort of turn to talk about neurodiversity in literature.
You mentioned literary neurodiversity, so that provides the perfect segue to the first question on my list, which is what exactly is literary neurodiversity?
So that's a great question, and it'll take me a teeny bit of a lengthy explanation, but I will be as condensed as possible. Basically, there are obviously many different ways to approach the study of literature, ranging from formal features like looking at literary devices or narrative structures, to investigating historical elements of literature, or to even investigating how readers respond to literature. There are many ways you can do it. And one thing that's become pretty popular in recent decades is investigating literature in terms of social identity categories. That is, looking at how things like race and class and gender contribute to literary experience. So literary neurodiversity studies builds upon this by bringing the focus to human neurological diversity. And so the basic question becomes, how is the creation, the interpretation, and the reception of literature shaped by the fact that human beings naturally vary in their cognitive, emotional, and sensory functioning? And there are a couple of ways we can do this. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of specific emphasis on neurodivergence because many of the people working in the field are, like myself, neurodivergent. So there's this commitment to serving the interests of neurodivergent people as a vulnerable and marginalized population. So we might, for example, look at literary characters who are either identified as neurodivergent or who we might think to be neurodivergent. Or we might look at literary authors who identify as neurodivergent or we might think to be neurodivergent. We can also look at how neurodivergent people respond to and interpret literature in their own unique ways. And then even more specifically, we can even look at the way literature is written in terms of divergence by looking at things like how certain types of using language might be associated with forms of neurodivergence. And that's really interesting. So there's just one other thing that I should say because it really gets at the heart of what I'm doing, and it's relevant to my specific work. Obviously, the specific theorization of neurodiversity and neurodivergence is a late 20th century phenomenon. So literary neurodiversity studies is particularly good at studying and analyzing contemporary literature where an author might explicitly identify themselves as neurodivergent, or a character might identify themselves as neurodivergent. But as I said, I study literature from hundreds of years ago, and one of the really cool things is that we can also think about forms of neurological difference in the past before we even had the language and vocabulary of talking about things like autism or ADHD. So to stay with that example of autism, as far back as you go, there have always been autistic people or people whose way of being would now be known or seen to be as analogous to autism, even though they definitely didn't have that language. But we can still talk about the autistic-like qualities of a character or an author, even in literature from hundreds of years ago. And if the kind of proviso is that we have to be clear about not sort of rigidly diagnosing them because we don't have access to their full way of being. So I wouldn't ever say this character from the 1600s is autistic or this author was autistic, but we can still talk about how there's some autistic qualities to their way of being. And one of the things that's really cool about that is that it validates the fact that we have always been here. There have always been people like us long before we knew how to talk about it in the way that we do today. So that's sort of the basis of literary neurodiversity studies, and it's a field that I've become really excited about.
What changes have you seen in the way neurodiverse characters are portrayed in literature? Do you think there are more positive portrayals now compared to 20 or 30 years ago, or even earlier?
Okay, great. So that's a difficult question for me to give an exact answer to because I don't read much modern or contemporary literature. I'm always stuck hundreds of years ago in the past. But with that said, in terms of culture generally, I think it's absolutely true that we see more and more complex and also positive portrayals of neurodivergence today in books and TVs and films, etc. Of course, sometimes even well-meaning works still perpetuate unfortunate or harmful stereotypes. But in general, I think it's clear that neurodivergent people are being centered more than they ever have before. And art today is much more likely to validate and honor neurological difference than definitely when I was a kid, for example. So I think we're definitely making progress.
My next question is, who are your favorite autistic characters in literature? What do you like about them, and what do you hope people can learn from reading about them?
Sure. So I'll give you two answers, both from Shakespeare. One very known, well known, and another a little bit more obscure. And to repeat, just these characters aren't necessarily autistic per se, because that terminology wasn't available to Shakespeare, but they nonetheless have certain qualities that have made modern scholars associate them with autism. And the first is Hamlet, who's probably the most famous character that Shakespeare ever created. In the most basic sense, Hamlet is a character who feels apart and disconnected from the world that he lives in. He knows he's different from those around him, and other people know that he's different as well. And more specifically, he has several traits that we might associate with autism, such as some atypical language use, unconventional social behavior, an extreme sensitivity to stimuli, particularly in his environment, a tendency to fixate on things, and just a very intense inner world in general. So I think Hamlet, definitely, modern scholars have talked about his autistic-like qualities. And then another character I really like is this Roman general named Coriolanus, who stars in a play of that same name. And basically, Coriolanus is this incredible war hero who loves Rome, but he has a deep disdain for the actual Roman people who he fights on behalf of. And long story short, he comes back from this particularly notable military victory, and he's encouraged by all the people around him to run for public office, even though he's entirely unsuited for it. And in the middle of the play is his basically reluctant, disastrous attempt to win over the Roman people who he hates because he just cannot and will not follow social conventions. So scholars have also discussed Coriolanus as being autistic-like because he's very
Hmm.
rigid and awkward in social interactions, and so much of these eventually sort of banished from Rome by the people. And neither Hamlet nor Coriolanus are particularly good people. But that's something I sort of like about them because I think we don't only need to look to the past for positive examples of autistic-like behavior, because autistic people are just as human as anyone else, and they come in all shapes and sizes. And I appreciate that these complex, problematic, and even sometimes kind of bad characters are also portrayed as neurologically different. So I
Hmm.
think that these are two characters that I really like to hone in on when I'm reading Shakespeare.
Yeah, Melancholy Serjanquist from As You Like It, autistic or just depressed?
Right, exactly. And sort of the whole sort of register of early modern fool characters have often been associated with neurological difference for all sorts of reasons. So that kind of boundary between neurodivergent, depressed, melancholic is really interesting. And of course, in some ways, I would argue that anyone who considered themselves to be dispositionally melancholic in the Renaissance would be classified as neurodivergent
Mhm.
because their sort of way of being and their mind is working in a slightly different way than what is more typical. So I think melancholy is absolutely a form of neurodivergence, and that's another thing that plugs into Hamlet, of course, because he's also melancholic.
Are you, in your early literature studies, do you run across any female characters who appear to display characteristics of autism?
Well, one of my colleagues working on literary neurodiversity studies has talked about some of the neurodivergent features of the nurse in Romeo and Juliet,
Hmm.
who has some sort of interesting uses of language and things like that. So I'm not an expert in that, but there definitely are people working on that.
And in your book, you write about Othello. So why don't you tell us about him?
Yeah. So Othello, which is another famous Shakespeare play, is a really interesting case for a couple of reasons. So, for one thing, both the central characters, but there are two central characters, Othello and Iago, right? And both of them seem to be neurologically different. Othello appears to have epilepsy, which of course would make him neurodivergent. And his great sort of secret rival, Iago, has some habits of mind that have also been associated with autism. So there's some neurologically different characters at the core of the play. But even beyond those two characters, there's also a larger way in which Othello is much more generally interested in thinking about matters of cognition, emotion, perception, sensation, especially as those processes all become entwined with each other. And earlier I've said that the bread and butter of literary neurodiversity studies is studying neurodivergence and neurodivergent people. And we can obviously do that here with the main characters. But something that I also have argued in some of my work is that really, in a larger sense, any work of literature that investigates how we think, how we feel, how we sense, that those all contribute to the larger project of literary neurodiversity studies because it contributes to our greater understanding of human neurological diversity. So Othello is a great way of how you can look at both neurodivergent characters, but also neurodiversity in general by thinking about how people feel, how they think, how they sense. And I think that that also, as I said, contributes to neurodiversity studies, even if you're not specifically focused in on neurodivergence per se.
So now I'd like to shift the focus from neurodivergent characters to neurodivergent writers and ask you, do you have a favorite author who is known to be neurodiverse?
Sure. So I'll use a much more recent author now, though still one with some historical difference or a distance from us. Despite the fact that he lived decades before the actual theorization of neurodiversity, there's some clear evidence that the great novelist Vladimir Nabokov was neurodivergent. In his biography, he describes having frequent visual and auditory hallucinations as a child, and he also experienced profound synesthesia, or the mixing of senses, and a kind of neurological mingling of different forms of perception. So even though he wouldn't have the word neurodivergent to describe himself, I think that absolutely Nabokov would be considered neurodivergent. And what's really interesting about this is that he wrote some characters who seem neurodivergent by really any definition of the term. One I've been looking at recently is a protagonist in a novel called The Defense, who is this grandmaster chess player who is pretty obviously and clearly depicted as being autistic, despite the fact that that word never is used in the novel, and that concept of autism was just being sort of really invented at the time that the novel was written. So I think that Nabokov is a great place to look for neurodivergent characters, and I think he absolutely is neurodivergent in some sense of the word.
Yes, and of
Yes.
course, Nabokov is most famous for his book Lolita. So, why don't you tell us about the professor in Lolita? We usually
So
think of
that's
him as a
something that I'll have
villain
to,
because he was, an inappropriate relationship with a 12-year-old,
Mhm.
but well, maybe he's a little more nuanced than that.
yeah. Well, that's one you'll have to have me back on to talk about because I have not reread Lolita yet since sort of becoming interested in neurodiversity, but that's on my list to sort of see to what extent there is a sort of neurological difference element in Lolita. But it's obviously it raises a natural question since that's his most famous book by far, and I think there's probably
Yeah.
something there worth digging into.
Thank you very much, Brad. It's interesting. My English major wife was going to ask me if Humbert Humbert, or I think he'd now be called Epstein, is likely to be spectrum. But anyway, our virtual correspondent, Stacey Kennedy, will have a few questions for you as well.
Hi, thank you. I guess I'm gonna go a little hypothetical here, but have you met anyone modern times, or maybe how would you count yourself? Do you remind yourself of anyone, in particular, like, I don't know, historically, like Shakespeare or any of Shakespeare's character? Who do you think you remind yourself as from a past life or like herself?
That's a great question, and it ties back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago.
Uh-huh.
I see, even though he is an absolutely sort of awful person, that General Coriolanus, when I first read that play, I identified with him because one of the things that he has such trouble with is the sort of arbitrariness of social conventions. And he sort of refuses. There's no reason why he shouldn't do them. He just doesn't want to. And I sort of always related that, even though I hope I'm a much better person than he was and much nicer to people than he was. But there's the sense that sort of like he doesn't want to be inauthentic, and that's one of the things that he has a lot of problems with. And what we would probably say now is that what he's marked by is a refusal to mask. He will not mask
Mhm.
for the purposes of winning this political position that he's up for. And though I think, we obviously all mask to certain degrees, and do in many occasions, I sort of sometimes have that inner part of me that says, like, I don't want to have to mask right now. And I think that's something that I very much relate to. So Coriolanus is an absolutely wonderful play, and I encourage anyone to check it out. There's also a great film version of it that came out about a decade ago.
Thank you, Brad and Stacy. Well, you have another question for our guest.
Brad, tell us about the growing field of autism awareness.
In literature studies, which is my home, there's this growing sort of concentrated interest in the study of not just autism, but also neurodiversity in general. And in the last 10 years, people have begun to increasingly pay attention to these issues of literature and neurodiversity that I alluded to earlier. And there's been a kind of growing momentum. And what I sort of realized a couple of, I guess a year ago now, 18 months ago, was that there was all this work that was starting to be done, but there yet to had be an actual kind of like book that covers it all and that serves as an introduction. So that's actually what I set out to do in this book that I published this year called Literary Neurodiversity Studies, Current and Future Directions, which is basically taking all this smart work and brilliant work that my colleagues in the field have done and kind of presenting it in a single place where scholars and students can turn to look at the ways that we study literature and neurodiversity. So it's designed for a scholarly audience, but I tried to write it in a very approachable and accessible way. So I'm hoping it will be particularly interesting to anyone invested in literature and neurodiversity, not just to scholars, because the book basically contains an overview of the various ways that scholars talk about literature and neurodiversity. And it has some thoughts on the future of literary neurodiversity studies. And it talks more specifically about Othello, which we talked about a little bit earlier, to give a sort of sense of neurodiversity studies in general. So this field is developing, and one of the things that I hoped I could make a small contribution to is by writing this book to help give it something of an identity.
Thank you very much, Brad. We very much appreciate you, and we'll finish up in a bit. We'll now turn over to Stacey Kennedy, our cultural correspondent.
Hello, everybody. Today, there's a couple things I'll share. Saturday, August 2nd will be the next job club meeting on Zoom, and the speaker will be Kelly Rohim. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'll just say Kelly R for right now, but she will be the speaker on the title of Telling Your Story with Intention, in guiding participants through a simple, practical framework for talking about work, skills, and identity in every language. Kelly is a career coach and resume strategic, and the founder of, or a founder of Gumpton, which I imagine she will discuss that in the job club meeting as well. So again, Saturday, August 2nd, the next job club meeting on Zoom starting at 10 a.m. Curiosity. I brought them up before. They are an organization, and you can look them up at Curio Odyssey at .org. They are a science and playground zoo founders, or they help with sensory Sundays for those in the neurodivergent community and autism too. And people of all ages can sign up. You have to register by August 22nd, though, for this sensory Sunday for December 14th. There will be like a gathering, a group for a museum setting. That's pretty much what Curiosity does. And so yeah, go to their site, curiosity.org. They are Science Playground Zoo foundation of sorts. And yeah, register by August 22nd for this museum setting and neurodivergent hangout. So, oh yeah, again, that'll be September 14th for the Sensory Sunday hangout. Thank you.
Thank you again, Stacey. We'll now hear again from Jennifer Brooks, this time for her review.
Hello, literary enthusiasts, and welcome to another edition of AASCENTV, Life on the Autism Spectrum. We hope you've enjoyed watching our conversation with our guest, Professor Bradley J. Irish, who has written an academic treatise on literary neurodiversity studies. And if you don't happen to be in the mood for an academic treatise, but are still interested in the subject of autism and literature, I recommend All the Little Bird Hearts by Victoria Lloyd Barlow. She lives in Kent, which is somewhere in England, I believe. She is autistic, and so is her character, Sunday Forrester. And so the book is all about Sunday Forrester's attempts to interact with the world and get people to like her. This book is set in England in 1988, a time and place when autism was not widely recognized or appreciated. So many people just thought Sunday was weird or strange or odd or whatever word they use in England to describe it. So she relies on an etiquette book for advice on how to interact with people. And she thinks she's finally achieved some social success when a new lady moves in next door. And so they become very close, but then I definitely don't want to give you any spoilers, but the relationship turns out not to be what Sunday was hoping for. Yeah, that's an experience that I'm sure has been shared by many of us on the spectrum, finding out that somebody that we thought was a friend was not who we thought they were. And so, once again, the book is All the Little Bird Hearts, and the author is the autistic Victoria Lloyd Barlow.
Thank you again, Jennifer. Much appreciated. Well, folks, that is this broadcast for this time. I want to thank again, especially our guest, Dr. Bradley Irish of Arizona State University, for attending. I'm your co-host, Keith Halperin.
I'm your co-host, Will Burnick.
I'm Jennifer Brooks.
I'm Stacey Kennedy.
Hi, and I'm Brad Irish.
Thank you. And again, thank you everyone for AASCENTV. Until next time, stay well, stay safe.